Hey everyone, ready for another deep dive? Today we're going to be looking into a case that's really stayed with me. It's the disappearance of Nevaeh Kingbird.
Yeah, she was only 15 when she vanished from Bemidji, Minnesota, back in 2021.
It's just heartbreaking, and the more I read about it, the more questions I have. We're working from this article, The Disappearance of Nevaeh Kingbird, A Cry for Justice and Awareness. Have you had a chance to look at it?
I have, and one thing that really stuck out to me was how important her Ojibwe heritage was to her. Like, the article mentions she was fluent in the language.
Oh wow, at 15. That's pretty incredible.
It is. You don't see that very often these days. It really speaks to her connection to her culture.
Absolutely. So before we get into the night she disappeared, can you kind of paint a picture of who Nevaeh was? What was she like?
Well, she was this bright, athletic 15-year-old, into volleyball, always friendly, the kind of kid who made friends easily.
Yeah, I get that. The article mentions a few specific details about her appearance too, right?
Yeah. Right. Her mom always brings these up when she talks about Nevaeh. She had this distinctive blonde streak in her brown hair and a little scar near her left eyebrow.
It's those details that make it real, you know? It reminds you that she was a real person, not just a name in an article. Okay, so let's talk about the night she disappeared. October 21st, 2021. It sounds like a pretty typical Friday night for a teenager at first.
It does. She was at a house party. It wrapped up around 1 a.m., and she decided to walk to a friend's place.
Walk. How far was it?
About half a mile to a mobile home park.
Whoa. Half a mile? Alone? At 1 a.m. in October in northern Minnesota. That's a little unnerving.
It gets even more so when you consider what she was wearing: Nike slides.
Slides? Seriously?
Yeah, the article specifically mentions it. Not exactly the best footwear for a cold October night.
Okay, so she gets to her friend's place, they hang out, and then what?
Around 2 a.m., Nevaeh leaves on foot again, and that's it. No one's seen or heard from her since.
So she just vanishes. No witnesses, no security footage, nothing.
As far as we know, no one has come forward with any concrete information about what happened after she left the mobile home park.
I imagine the first thought was that maybe she ran away.
Yeah, that's what authorities initially considered. But her family is adamant that she wouldn't have just taken off like that, especially not for this long.
It has been a while, hasn't it?
Years, actually. This happened back in 2021, and they're still searching.
Okay, so let's talk about those search efforts. What's been done to try and find Nevaeh?
Well, right after she disappeared, her family started searching, and then the Bemidji police got involved. Volunteers joined in. It was a huge effort. And then in 2023, the Minnesota Missing and Murdered Indigenous Relatives Office, the MMIR, got involved.
The MMIR, I've heard of them. They deal specifically with cases involving Indigenous people, right?
Exactly. And they organized this massive search in 2023. Over 100 volunteers, K-9 units, they covered 150 acres.
Wow, that's intense. Did they find anything?
Not really. They collected some items that they sent for forensic testing, but nothing that could conclusively say what happened to her. The article quotes the director of the MMIR, Juliette Rudy, and you can just hear the frustration in her voice. She says, "We hope to find something definitive, but the search has not provided the answers we so desperately need."
It's just heartbreaking. All those people putting in so much effort and still no answers. But despite all this, the article really emphasizes how Nevaeh's mom, Teddy Wind, has never given up hope.
Oh, absolutely. She's been this incredible advocate for her daughter, using social media, talking to the press, anything to keep Nevaeh's name out there.
Yeah, there's this one quote from her that really got to me. She said, "Nevaeh is not forgotten. We will never stop searching for her."
It's powerful stuff, a real testament to a mother's love, but there's another layer to this story, and it's a disturbing one.
You're talking about the fact that Nevaeh was a Ojibwe.
Exactly. This case, as tragic as it is, highlights a much bigger issue that Indigenous communities face, particularly women and girls.
So we were talking about how Nevaeh, being Ojibwe, adds another dimension to this story. Is there something about that, about being Indigenous, that makes her more vulnerable?
Sadly, yeah. You see, Nevaeh's case, as awful as it is, isn't unique. Indigenous women and girls go missing or are murdered at just, unbelievably high rates. It's a real problem.
How high are we talking?
Well, the Urban Indian Health Institute, they say Indigenous women are murdered at 10 times the national average. Think about that. 10 times.
That's horrifying. Why is that? What leads to that?
It's complicated. It's not just one thing. It's a mix of historical trauma, racism, lack of resources in our communities. It all adds up.
Okay, let's break that down a bit. What do you mean by historical trauma?
Well, imagine, right, generations of your people being forced to assimilate, losing their land, having their culture basically wiped out. That creates a kind of vulnerability that's really hard to escape.
And that vulnerability seems to be even worse for Indigenous women and girls specifically.
Yeah, they face a lot of unique dangers, domestic violence, human trafficking. And a lot of times, their cases don't get the attention they should from law enforcement or the media.
It's like they're being ignored, silenced.
That's a big part of it, unfortunately. And that's where organizations like the MMIR, the ones who helped search for Nevaeh, come in. They're really trying to bring attention to this, advocate for more resources, make sure these cases are investigated properly.
So they're kind of like a special task force just for these cases.
Yeah, exactly. They get the specific challenges these cases have, the issues with jurisdiction, the fact that there's not great data collection. They're tackling that head on.
Seems like they've got a lot to do.
Yeah.
But back to Nevaeh's case, what are we left with? What are the big questions? We've talked about why this might happen, but what about the how? Did you run into someone that night? Was there foul play involved?
Those are the million-dollar questions, right? And until we have answers, the search for Nevaeh, for justice, it just keeps going.
It's almost like there's this wall of silence surrounding her disappearance.
Yeah.
It's going to be so frustrating.
It is, and it really points to that distrust that exists between law enforcement and a lot of Indigenous communities, something the MMIR is working to fix, thankfully.
So finding Nevaeh is important, but so is dealing with these bigger problems that put Indigenous women and girls at risk in the first place.
Exactly. It's about breaking that cycle of violence and injustice that's been going on for far too long, changing the system so that what happened to Nevaeh doesn't happen to anyone else.
Okay, that makes sense.
Really?
So where do we go from here? How do we even start fixing a problem this big?
Well, first off, people got to know about it. Like, awareness is huge. People need to understand how serious this is, the impact it has on families, communities.
So spreading the word, making sure people know this is happening, that's step one.
Exactly. Tell people about Nevaeh's story, talk to your friends, do some reading, educate yourself. The more people know, the better. Then comes the action. We need more money for law enforcement to really investigate these cases. And they need to be trained to work with Indigenous communities in a way that's respectful and builds trust.
Speaking of communities, I remember the article talked about programs within those communities too. What's the role of those?
Oh, they're essential. We need to support programs that help Indigenous youth address domestic violence, offer mental health services that are culturally relevant, Prevention and early intervention are key here.
It sounds like we need to attack this from all sides. Awareness, law enforcement, community support, changing the system itself to get at the root causes.
Nailed it. It's a complex issue, needs a complex response. But what about our listeners, right? What can they do to help?
Besides just being aware, what actions can actually make a difference?
Honestly, there's so much you can do. You can donate to groups like the MMIR, support Indigenous-led efforts, talk to your elected officials about policy changes. Most importantly, though, stay informed, keep the conversation going.
It's easy to feel overwhelmed by how big this problem is, but even small actions can help, right?
Absolutely. Every voice matters. Every little bit of support adds up and makes a difference in the fight for justice.
Thinking about Nevaeh's family, they've been searching for years, holding on to hope. How do they keep going after something like this?
Well, the article doesn't really get into their day-to-day life, but you can imagine the pain, the questions they must have every single day. But they've been amazingly strong, turning their grief into action, fighting for Nevaeh and for other families in the same position.
It's hard to comprehend that kind of strength, turning such a terrible loss into a force for change.
It really is. It shows you what the human spirit can do, the power of love and hope, even in the darkest moments. But their struggle also highlights something very specific that a lot of Indigenous youth face.
What do you mean?
Well, think back to what we talked about before. Generations of trauma, cultural disruption, forced assimilation. That stuff doesn't just disappear, it gets passed down.
You're talking about intergenerational trauma.
Exactly. It's like this wound that gets carried from one generation to the next, and it can show up in all kinds of ways. Mental health struggles, substance abuse, violence. It's a heavy load to bear.
So on top of everything else, Indigenous youth are dealing with the pain of their ancestors. That's a lot.
It is. And it makes them that much more vulnerable to exploitation, violence, to disappearing like Nevaeh did.
It's hard to grasp, that weight, that inherited trauma, on top of everything else, it feels impossible to escape.
It's a tough reality. But there are things happening, things that give you hope. There are people, organizations working hard to support these kids, help them heal, reclaim their heritage.
I'm glad to hear that. What are some of the things that are helping to break that cycle?
One thing that's really interesting is this movement to bring traditional healing practices into mental health services for Indigenous youth.
Like what kind of practices?
Well, some communities are using talking circles, sweat lodges, ceremonies like that as part of their treatment programs. The idea is to deal with the trauma in a way that fits with their culture.
Yeah, that makes sense. Healing needs to be rooted in understanding and connection.
Exactly. And it can't just be about fixing the trauma. It's also about giving these kids a chance to thrive, to be proud of who they are, investing in their education, their communities.
It sounds like a lot of different approaches are needed. But let's get back to the investigation for a minute. Anything new in the article about Nevaeh's case? Any leads?
Unfortunately, no. No major breakthroughs in the investigation. But they keep stressing how important it is for people to stay aware, for the community to stay involved.
So even though it's been years, we can't let Nevaeh's case be forgotten.
Definitely not. Keep sharing her story. Keep pushing law enforcement to follow every lead. And keep supporting her family.
This deep dive has been really eye-opening, but I gotta admit, it also leaves you feeling a bit helpless. Like, what can I actually do? I'm just one person.
Don't underestimate yourself. Seriously, even one voice can make a difference. Start by learning more about this issue, missing and murdered Indigenous people. Talk to people about it. Share Nevaeh's story online. Donate to organizations that are working to help, like the MAIR. Volunteer your time, even.
Those are all good ideas. And if there's one thing I want our listeners to take away from this, it's that this isn't just an Indigenous issue. This is about all of us.
100%. We're all connected. When one community is hurting, we all feel it. We need to stand together, support each other, and demand justice for Nevaeh and for everyone who's gone missing.
Well said. As we wrap up, I want to leave everyone with a question. What can you do today to be a part of this? What action, big or small, can you take to honor Nevaeh's memory and to make sure no other family goes through this?
We all have a choice to make, but the important thing is don't stay silent. Speak up, demand justice, work together to create a world where everyone is safe, everyone is valued.
Thank you for sharing all that, and thanks to all of you for joining us for this deep dive. It was a heavy topic, but an important one. Until next time, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep fighting for what's right.